In the Moon Dominion, marriage was never a matter of the heart. It was a ledger, a negotiation, a transaction weighed in territory and sealed in bloodlines long before any wolf's true mate ever entered the room. For 5 years, Alpha King Kaelen Nightfang had rejected every bride the council placed before his throne. Noble daughters, warrior heirs, a foreign princess from beyond the northern ranges, each one dismissed with the same tired silence, until the elders had run out of names to offer him. Then, on an unremarkable afternoon in a border town too small to appear on any map, a quiet Omega, who needed a husband for exactly 1 day, walked up to a dust-covered stranger and asked the one question that would undo everything. But before crowns and kingdoms mattered, Naia Ashbourne had a much smaller problem. She had less than a day left to save the only home she had. Rain had been falling over Thistlebrook for 3 days straight, turning the market road to soup and driving half the town under the eaves of the trading post. Naia didn't mind it. Rain kept the shop quiet, and quiet was the only thing that had ever belonged to her. She measured dried mint into a jar, hands steady, the way they'd been steady through 6 years of building this life from nothing. A healer's shop, a handful of loyal customers, and a sanctuary 2 miles north that housed 11 Omega children who had nowhere else to go. The letter sat open on the counter beside her. She'd read it 11 times already. "It still says the same thing," said old Selwyn, hunched by the stove, not looking up from his tea. "Reading it a 12th time won't change the ink." "I know what it says." Naia's voice was calm. Her hands were not quite. "Grandmother's will passes the sanctuary to the nearest married relative, unless I'm wed by sunrise tomorrow. My father's already filed the claim. Celine and Lyra will have the deed by noon. Your father wants a healer's cottage full of orphaned pups? My father wants the land it sits on. He'll have the children out by winter." Selwyn finally looked up. "So find a husband. By sunrise, tomorrow." She almost laughed. "Almost. Selwyn, I don't have a suitor hiding in the herb cabinet." "Then hire one." She meant to say something sharp back. Instead, the words caught in her throat and simply sat there. Hire one. It was a joke. It had to be a joke. Except the more she turned it over, the less it sounded like nonsense, and the more it sounded like the only door still open to her. A marriage witnessed by a moon priest. No love required. No bond required. Not for a document. Not for a deed. Just 2 names on a scroll before the sun came up. She was still standing frozen behind the counter when the bell above the door rang, and the rain blew in with him. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now, let's dive in. He didn't announce himself. He simply filled the doorway. Travel cloak soaked through. Dust ground into the seams of his boots despite the mud outside, like he'd crossed more roads than just the one into Thistlebrook. A fresh scar cut pale across one knuckle. His eyes swept the shop once, quick and thorough, the way a soldier checks a room for exits before he checks it for anything else. "Something for a headache," he said, low voice. No wasted words. Naia reached for the mountain mint without thinking, the way she reached for it a dozen times a day. She set the cup down in front of him. "No sugar," she said. "It'll only make it worse." He looked at the tea, then at her, longer than a stranger should. "You didn't ask what kind of headache." "I didn't need to." She nodded toward the door, toward the rain, toward whatever weight sat behind his eyes that had nothing to do with weather. "Long road behind you. Longer one still ahead, probably." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "Kale," he offered, which wasn't quite an introduction, and wasn't quite nothing either. "Naia." He drank the tea in silence. She went back to her jars, her hands finding work because her mind couldn't sit still. Selwyn had gone conveniently deaf in the corner, sipping his own cup with the studied innocence of a man pretending not to listen. The letter was still on the counter. Naia's eyes kept sliding to it, then to the stranger, then back again, the idea taking shape whether she wanted it to or not. He wasn't from here. He'd be gone by week's end, wherever he was headed. No ties, no history with her family, no reason to care what happened to a healer's shop in a rain-soaked border town, except, perhaps, one good reason, if the coin was right. She set down the jar, wiped her hands on her apron, and before she could talk herself out of it, before pride or sense could catch up to her mouth. She crossed the shop and stood in front of him. "I have a strange question," she said. He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Would you marry a complete stranger?" The rain kept falling outside. Selwyn's cup froze halfway to his lips. And Kael, Alpha King of the Moon Dominion, 5 years unmarried by choice, 3 days into the first stretch of freedom he'd had since his coronation, looked at the quiet Omega standing in front of him, like she'd just asked the only honest question anyone had put to him in years. "That depends," he said slowly, "on why you're asking." "That depends," Kael said again, "on why you're asking." Naia didn't flinch under the question, and that, more than anything, was what caught him. 3 days ago, he'd been Alpha King Kaelen Nightfang, standing in a council chamber, while 7 noble families paraded their daughters like breeding stock, each father reciting bloodlines, the way merchants recited prices. "Her lineage traces to the old Pax, Your Majesty. Her mother birthed 4 healthy pups on her first litter alone. He'd sat through it with his jaw locked and his wolf pacing beneath his skin, and when the meeting ended, he had done something he hadn't done in 5 years of ruling. He'd walked out, alone. No guard, no procession, no crown. He'd shed his title at the palace gates, like a coat too heavy for the season, and given himself 1 week, just one, to remember what it felt like to be a man before he was a king. He had not planned on being proposed to by a healer with tea-stained fingers on the second day of it. "I need a husband before sunrise tomorrow," Naia said. No embarrassment in it. No performance either. None of the practiced tremor he'd heard from noble daughters trained to look fragile in front of powerful men. She simply stated it. The way she'd stated the tea would make his headache worse with sugar. "There's a will, a sanctuary, 11 children who'll lose their home if I'm not married by dawn. I have money saved, not much, but enough to make it worth a stranger's time. You're offering to pay me to marry you. I'm offering to pay you to say you'll marry me. There's a difference." She held his gaze, steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "It doesn't have to mean anything beyond the ceremony. You'd be gone within the week, I imagine. Men like you usually are. Men like you." She had no idea what she was looking at. His wolf, restless since the moment he'd crossed the Dominion's border, went suddenly, sharply still, the way it stilled before a hunt. Though this didn't feel like hunting, it felt like being found, not because of fate. He didn't believe in fate, not anymore. Not since the council had spent 5 years trying to arrange it for him like a trade agreement. This was something smaller and stranger. The simple fact that she had told him the truth without being asked, and asked nothing false of him in return. "I'll consider it," he said, "on terms." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, that he hadn't laughed at her. Terms. 1 week. Not a lifetime. Not even a moon cycle. 1 week. And then the marriage dissolves. Quietly, however your laws allow for that. He watched her nod, already tracking the arrangement like a woman doing sums in her head. "No intimacy expected. Or offered. This is a transaction, as you said." "Agreed. And no lies," he added. "That could hurt anyone who isn't part of this bargain. Not your children. Not mine." He caught himself, barely, and covered it by taking another slow drink of the tea. "Not anyone innocent in it. Whatever this becomes, it doesn't become a weapon against people who didn't choose it." Naia studied him a moment too long, as if that particular condition told her something the others hadn't. "Agreed," she said again, quieter. "Then I suppose you have yourself a husband." He extended a hand across the counter. Not the gesture of a man sealing a romance, but the flat, businesslike shake of 2 merchants closing a deal. Her palm was warm and calloused from years of grinding herbs, and when their hands met, something low and unfamiliar moved through his chest, gone before he could name it. He told himself it was nothing. His wolf disagreed, already cataloging her. The tilt of her head when she listened, the low, unhurried cadence of her voice, the way she hadn't once glanced at his crest ring, tucked beneath his glove, where no one in Thistlebrook would think to look for a king's mark. He shifted his weight, and the old wound in his leg, 3 months healed, still stubborn on wet days, pulled tight enough that his stride caught for half a step on the way to the door. Naia noticed. Of course she noticed. Noticing seemed to be the entire architecture of her. "You're limping. It's old," It's still limping. She didn't press further, didn't ask where a wound like that came from, or what kind of man carried a scar that particular shape. She simply crossed back to her shelf, wrapped a small paper twist of something dried and bitter-smelling, and pressed it into his hand without being asked. Steep it before you sleep. It won't heal the leg, but it'll ease the ache enough that you rest. You don't know anything about me, he said, testing her. I don't need to. She met his eyes, and there was no curiosity in it, no hunger to unravel him the way every noble in his council chamber hungered to unravel his weaknesses and use them. You needed tea without sugar and something for your leg. That's enough for today. His wolf, watching her from somewhere just beneath his ribs, went very quiet. The particular quiet of something that had stopped searching for a reason to stay wary. Tomorrow, then, Kael said. Sunrise. Naia nodded once, already turning back to her jars, already steadying herself for a wedding that meant nothing and, somehow, felt like it might mean everything. Neither of them said another word. But outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. Sunrise came gray and thin over Thistlebrook. The last of the storm still rung out in the clouds. There was no hall, no flowers, no silver, no gathered nobility watching from gilded chairs. Just the small moon shrine at the edge of town, its stone worn smooth by 200 years of quieter vows than this one, and a priest who'd been roused from sleep with a knock and a handful of coin. Selwyn stood as witness on Naia's side, arms crossed, eyeing Kael with the particular suspicion of an old man who'd outlived 3 kings and trusted none of them. On Kael's side stood no one, which the priest noted with a raised brow and did not ask about twice. Naia wore the same gray dress she wore to open her shop every morning. No silver thread, no white lace. When the priest asked if she came to this bond freely, she said yes without hesitation, and when he turned to Kael and asked the same, there was a half-second pause. Not doubt, exactly, but the strange vertigo of a king binding himself to a stranger, under a name that wasn't his own. Yes, Kael said. The priest pressed the moon-marked cord around their joined wrists, murmured the old words about union and witness, and the goddess who watched all bonds whether true mated or not. And then it was done. No feast, no dancing. Just 2 people standing in the thin morning light, married, and a document the priest would file with the town registrar by noon. That's it? Kael asked, when the cord was untied and the priest had shuffled back toward the shrine. That's it. Naia was already turning toward the road, tying her cloak against the lingering chill. Come on, I want to introduce you before the children wake properly. They don't do well with strangers who show up without warning. The sanctuary sat 2 miles north, past the last of the trading posts, where the road narrowed into forest, and the forest opened into a clearing that smelled of wood smoke and wet pine. The building itself was old, clearly repaired more times than it had been built, with a patched roof and shutters painted the same soft ivory as the door. Before they'd even crossed the yard, a small girl came barreling out of it, dark hair flying loose from its braid. Naia? She crashed into her with the full, unrestrained force of a child who'd been counting the hours. Rennie said you weren't coming back till after the rain, but I said you always come back. I said it. I always come back, Tilly. Naia crouched to catch her properly, brushing a leaf from her hair with the ease of long practice. Where's Rennie? And Bram? Did he sleep? Or did he sit up by the window again? He sat up. He said he was watching for you. A boy's voice, sheepish, from the doorway. Older, maybe 12, arms crossed in the universal posture of a child pretending he hadn't worried. Bram. Naia's voice softened in a way Kael hadn't heard yet, warm and unguarded. You know the wolves don't come this close to the sanctuary boundary anymore. I told you that. I know. Bram shrugged, and Naia crossed the yard and pulled him into a brief, easy hug that he only pretended to resist. Kael stood at the edge of it all, watching. He had spent 5 years in council chambers memorizing bloodlines, alliances, the precise weight of every noble family's ambition. He had never once seen anyone do what Naia did in the span of 2 minutes. Greet 9, 10, 11 children by name, ask after a nightmare one of them had mentioned in passing weeks ago, remember that a boy called Corwin hated turnip stew, and that a girl named Ivy was terrified of thunder, and needed the door left open a crack during storms. She wasn't performing kindness for an audience. There was no audience here that mattered to politics, no council to impress, no bloodline to secure. She simply knew these children, the way a mother knows a child, except none of them were hers by blood, and all of them, clearly, were hers by everything else. "This is Kael," she told them eventually, once the chaos had settled into something like order. "He'll be staying with us this week." Small faces turned toward him, assessing in that unguarded, unfiltered way only children managed. Tilly tilted her head. "For a week," Kael said, and found, to his own surprise, that the words didn't sit as easily as he'd expected them to. "Is that a long time?" "Not particularly." Tilly seemed to accept this, with the philosophical shrug of a child who'd learned early that adults' arrangements rarely made sense, and went sprinting back toward the others, already losing interest. Naia caught Kael watching her a moment later, something unreadable in his expression. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, though it wasn't nothing. It was the slow, unfamiliar recognition that the woman who'd hired a stranger for coin ran an entire sanctuary on nothing but will and devotion, and had never once mentioned it as though it were remarkable. His respect for her, quiet and unbidden, had begun somewhere between the shrine and the yard, and showed no sign of stopping. Far south, in a palace bathed in far more silver than the shrine had ever seen, royal guards were combing the corridors for a king who had vanished 3 days ago without escort or explanation, and the council had begun, quietly, and then not so quietly, to panic. The days at the sanctuary folded into each other faster than Naia expected, until 1 week stopped feeling like a countdown and started feeling, dangerously, like a life. A borrowed one, a temporary one, but a life all the same. Mornings still began with tea. That hadn't changed. What had changed was that Kael no longer waited at the table for it. He stood beside her at the stove instead, measuring dried mint with a precision that surprised her, until she realized he was simply watching her hands and copying them. "Exactly. You're doing it wrong," she told him the third morning, nudging his elbow. "I'm doing it the way you did it. I add the mint after the water boils. You added it before. You didn't say that part out loud. I assumed a man who commands." She caught herself, not sure where the sentence had been headed, and covered it by taking the kettle from his hand. "I assumed you'd ask." He didn't ask, but the next morning he waited for the water to boil first, and said nothing about it, and she pretended not to notice that he'd learned. Cooking, it turned out, he was hopeless at. Burned the first pot of stew so thoroughly that Bram declared it worse than rogue cooking, which sent Tilly into a fit of laughter so violent she had to sit down on the kitchen floor. Kael didn't defend himself. He simply handed the spoon back to Naia with the grave dignity of a man conceding a battle, and the sound of her laughing, really laughing, unguarded, settled somewhere in his chest and stayed there. The roof was worse than either of them had expected. 3 seasons of storms had rotted through the west corner, and when Kael climbed up to assess it, Naia stood below with her arms crossed, already certain she'd need to send for the carpenter in town by evening. She didn't. He worked through it in an afternoon, steady, unhurried, lifting beams that should have taken 2 grown men to carry as though they weighed nothing at all. When she asked where he'd learned carpentry, he only said, "I've fixed worse, in worse weather," and offered nothing further. She noticed the way the muscle in his forearms worked as he set the final beam. She noticed herself noticing, and looked away first. The wolf pup came to them on the 4th night. Bram found it tangled in briar at the tree line, back leg torn, too frightened to let anyone near. Naia knelt in the mud, coaxing it with the softest voice she had, and got nowhere. Then Kael crouched beside her. He didn't speak. He simply held out one open hand, low to the ground, and the pup, trembling, wild-eyed, ready to bite anything that came within reach, went suddenly, inexplicably still. It crept forward and pressed its head into his palm, as though it had known him its whole short life. "How did you—" "Animals settle for confidence," he said. "That's all." But that wasn't all, and she knew it wasn't. She'd seen him walk the boundary line at dusk and watched a full-grown lone wolf, easily wild, easily dangerous, dip its head low and slink back into the trees without so much as a growl. She'd heard him murmur to Selwyn, Once, about the sanctuary's weakest point, the northeast ridge, in words too precise, too tactical, for a wandering stranger who claimed no soldiering in his past. She didn't ask. He'd told her once that some things weren't lies so much as unspoken, and she found, uncomfortably, that she was starting to let him have that. That night, after the children slept, and the pup lay bandaged and breathing steady by the hearth, Naia and Kael sat on the porch steps without any particular reason to, the way people who are pretending not to want each other's company often do. "You're good with them," Kael said. "The children. They're good with me." She glanced over, firelight catching the scar on his cheek. "You're good with the wolves, and the roof, and apparently everything except cooking. Apparently?" She laughed, quiet and real, and he found himself watching her mouth instead of the tree line for the first time since he'd arrived in Thistlebrook. Somewhere beneath that, distant and unwelcome, came the understanding that the wall he'd built 5 years ago, brick by brick, council meeting by council meeting, was developing cracks he had never authorized. He should have minded that more than he did. Instead, he sat there, listening to the fire settle, and the pup's steady breathing, and the woman beside him saying nothing at all, and thought, for the first time in longer than he could name, that he was in no hurry for the week to end. South of Thistlebrook, in a palace hung with silver banners no one had dared take down, the Council of the Moon Dominion had stopped pretending calm. 3 days. 3 days since the king's personal guard had lost his trail at the eastern gate, and the search had turned up nothing since but rumor and a single scorched banner bearing a wolf's head sigil that belonged, unmistakably, to the Duskmore Pax. "They've taken him," Elder Vashti said, for the 4th time that morning, her voice fraying at the edges. "Or worse. Then we prepare." General Thorne was already unrolling a map of the eastern border across the war table, his finger tracing a line of march. "If Duskmore holds the king, we do not wait for a ransom demand to become a funeral notice." Around the table, old men who hadn't drawn a blade in a decade began speaking, very seriously, of war. None of them knew their king was, at that exact moment, up to his elbows in flour, losing a baking contest to an 11-year-old. At the sanctuary, the morning had gone soft and easy, in a way the last 5 days had made almost familiar. Naia found Kael in the kitchen before dawn, exactly where he'd taken to standing now, beside the stove, waiting for the water to boil before he added the mint, the way she'd taught him without ever quite meaning to. He'd stopped asking if she needed help. He simply gave it. The way the roof over the west corner no longer leaked. The way the wolf pup, healing well, half tame now, had taken to sleeping across his boots each night instead of hers. "You're smiling," he said, without turning around. "Tilly wants a rematch. Yesterday's bread was inedible, and she's decided it's your fault for distracting her." "That was distinctly her fault. I only asked her to taste the dough." "You asked her to taste the dough 4 times. He handed her a cup. No sugar, and something in the plain rhythm of it. His hands, her hands, the same small kitchen, the same quiet hour, had become, without either of them naming it, the best part of her day. She was still holding the cup, still half laughing, when the dogs began to bark. Not the sanctuary's dogs. Naia's mind caught the wrongness of it before her body did. Something larger moving through the tree line, disciplined in a way no traitor or rogue wolf ever moved. Kael went still beside her, not startled, recognizing. By the time they reached the yard, a column of riders in gray and silver livery had already crossed the boundary. At their head, a broad-shouldered man dismounted, before his horse had fully stopped, crossing the muddy yard in 6 long strides. He didn't look at Naia. He didn't look at the children gathering wide-eyed in the doorway behind her. He looked only at Kael, and something in his face broke open with relief, so complete, it looked almost like grief. Then he dropped to one knee in the mud. "My king," his voice cracked on it. "We feared Duskmore had taken you. The council has called for war within the week." The yard went silent. Naia's cup slipped an inch in her hand before she caught it. "My king." She looked at Kael, at the man who fixed roofs and burned stew and gentled wild wolves with an open palm, who'd told her on the very first day that he'd give her nothing but the truth that mattered, and felt every piece rearrange itself into a shape she hadn't let herself see, the wolves that bowed to him without being asked. The strategy he'd known and never once explained. The scar, The bearing, the stillness of a man used to commanding rooms without raising his voice. Of course. Of course. Naia. Kael turned to her, already reaching. Don't. The word came out quiet. Not sharp. Worse than sharp. Even. Controlled. The voice she used for frightened children and grieving strangers. The voice that meant she had already stepped somewhere he couldn't follow. Not here. She set the cup down on the porch rail, very carefully, the way she set down anything she didn't want to break further. Tilly. Her voice was perfectly level as she turned toward the door. Bram. Inside, please. Now. The children went. She followed them without looking back, and the door closed behind her. Not slammed, not even hard, just closed, the way she closed everything she meant to protect. The captain remained kneeling, waiting for orders. Kael gave none. He was still watching the door. Your Majesty, the captain tried again, softer now, aware, belatedly, that he'd interrupted something he didn't understand. The council believes. I heard you the first time. Kael's voice was flat. Tell them I live. Tell them there is no war. I will return within the week, as promised, and not a day sooner. The captain hesitated, then bowed his head and withdrew to relay the order, leaving Kael alone in the mud, with the taste of failure he hadn't felt in years. He had built walls for 5 years, council meetings, false smiles, a crown he wore like armor because it kept people at exactly the distance he wanted. He had not expected the wall to come down from a woman who made his tea without sugar and remembered which of her children feared thunder. He had not expected it to matter this much when she built one of her own, quietly, without a single raised word, and shut it between them before he'd even had the chance to explain. That was the part that found him hours later, still standing where the captain had knelt. Not her silence, not even the betrayal she had every right to feel. It was that she hadn't slammed a single door, and Kaelen Nightfang, who had faced down rogue armies without flinching, found he had no strategy at all for that. 2 days of careful distance had taught Naia exactly how to live beside a man without truly living beside him. She still made his tea. She simply no longer stood at the stove to watch him drink it. She still answered when he spoke to her, in the same even voice she'd used since the captain knelt in the mud. Polite, complete, entirely closed. Kael had tried, twice, to breach it. Once at the porch steps, once in the kitchen doorway. Both times she'd found a reason to be needed elsewhere, and both times he'd let her go, because pressing on a door that someone is holding shut so gently only ever makes the hinges louder. Word, it turned out, traveled faster than either of them had planned for. By the second morning, a carriage Naia hadn't seen in 6 years came rattling up the sanctuary road, mud-splattered and trailed by 2 riders. She knew the crest before she recognized the man stepping down from it. Alpha Cedric Ashbourne had not once, in 6 years, sent word to his youngest daughter. He arrived now with his coat freshly brushed and his smile freshly rehearsed. Naia. Warmth, where there had only ever been dismissal. My girl. Why didn't you send word yourself? I had to hear it from a council courier. My own daughter, wed to the Alpha King. You heard it because it isn't yours to be told first, Naia said. It never was. If the words landed, Cedric didn't let them show. Behind him, Celine and Lyra emerged from the carriage, taking in the patched roof and the muddy yard with the polite, contained horror of women recalculating a person's worth in real time. It's rustic, Lyra offered, in the tone of someone trying very hard to be generous. Celine said nothing at all. Naia could see her calculating already exactly how useful a king's new family might turn out to be. It's home, Naia said. Of course, of course. Cedric spread his hands, already moving past her toward the door, already speaking of family and reconciliation, and how proud your grandmother would be, and Naia understood, with a clarity that didn't even sting anymore, that he hadn't come for her at all. He'd come for what she now stood beside. She kept them from the children. That much she could manage. The council arrived the following afternoon, with far less warmth and far more purpose. Elder Vashti came at the head of a small delegation. General Thorne, a silent, armored shadow behind her, and asked to speak with Kael alone in the room Naia used for treating the sick. Naia gave them the room. She did not go far. She told herself, afterward, that she hadn't meant to listen. But the door was old, the walls thin, and Vashti's voice was not built for softness. "A healer, your majesty. Untitled. Unbonded to any pack of standing. The law requires a council-sanctioned union for succession to hold. You know this better than any of us." "I know the law." Kael's voice, low, controlled. "I also know it was written by men trying to keep power inside 4 families. Duskmore is massing at the eastern ridge as we speak. Thorn, blunt as a blade. Lady Aurelia of the Kestrel Pack brings 300 warriors as dowry and a border alliance we cannot survive without, if it comes to war. The Omega in the next room brings none of that. Whatever this arrangement has been, it ends today, or it ends the kingdom." A long silence, longer than Naia could bear. "I have given no order to end anything," Kael said finally. It wasn't a refusal. Naia heard that too, heard the careful, unfinished shape of it. A king choosing his words the way a soldier chooses ground, buying time rather than making a stand. She didn't blame him for it. He had a kingdom. He had warriors who would die on a border she'd never seen, for a war she'd never asked anyone to risk. She simply understood, standing very still in the hallway with her hand pressed flat against the wall, that there was no version of this where she stayed, and the wolves at that ridge didn't pay for it. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying was a luxury reserved for people who had somewhere soft to fall. That night, she found Selwyn by the hearth, and told him only what he needed to know, that she'd be gone by morning, that the children were to hear nothing until she was well down the road, that the sanctuary's deed was safe now regardless of what happened to her, because a king's name, even one she left behind, would protect it better than she ever could alone. "He'll come after you," Selwyn said. "Then I hope he's wise enough not to." She pressed a folded paper into his hand. Instructions, nothing more. No explanation Kael would find satisfying, and none she owed him. "Tell Tilly I'll send for her birthday. Tell Bram to stop sitting up at the window." On her way out, she stopped once, just long enough to stand in the doorway of the room where 11 children slept in a tangle of blankets. Tilly's arm flung over Bram's shoulder the way it always ended up by morning. She memorized it. She had a feeling she'd need to, for a while. She left before the sky had fully lightened, past the sleeping pup curled on a pair of boots that weren't hers to miss. Out through the trees she'd walked 1,000 times, carrying nothing but the certainty that some kinds of love cost too much for the people who can't afford the war that comes with them. Behind her, the sanctuary slept on, unaware that the quietest person in it had already said goodbye. She didn't get past the 2nd mile. The road out of Thistlebrook cut through low pine before opening onto the eastern highway, and Naia had barely reached the tree line when she heard hooves behind her. Too fast for a trader, too controlled for anyone but a man who'd chased far worse things across far worse terrain. Kael didn't dismount right away. He simply held the horse steady beside her, matching her pace, until she stopped walking, because there was no dignity left in pretending she could outwalk a king. "Selwyn told you. Selwyn told me nothing he didn't have to." Kael swung down, careful of the leg that still ached in wet weather. He handed me a folded paper, and a look that suggested I deserved worse. "I'm not coming back to be part of your war, Kael. Then don't come back for me." His voice was steady, stripped of any softness she could have refused more easily. "The council has called a moon trial. If you're not standing in that circle when they open it, the marriage dissolves by default, and your father's claim on the sanctuary stands unopposed, by any decree, mine or your grandmother's. You didn't marry a stranger to protect yourself. Running now doesn't protect the children either. It only makes the running for nothing." She hated that he was right. She hated more that he'd known exactly which argument would work, and hadn't reached for a softer one. "For the sanctuary," she said, "not for you. I never asked for the other thing," Kael said, quiet enough that it almost sounded true. The moon trial convened at dusk 2 days later, in the stone circle beneath the palace's oldest courtyard, a place older than the council itself, where an Alpha King's Luna had been tested for 3 centuries under the same unwritten law. She who would stand beside the throne must first prove she strengthens the kingdom around it. Naia stood in the center of that circle in her plain gray dress, and the crowd gathered around its edge. Warriors still bandaged from border skirmishes, servants who'd walked from the kitchens to watch, Omega families pressed close together at the back, where they always stood, and, near the front, Lady Aurelia of the Kestrel Pack in silver blue silk, flanked by 2 noble companions who'd traveled with her for exactly this purpose. A healer, Aurelia said, just loud enough to carry. How touching. I do hope the kingdom's enemies agree to be treated with chamomile. Laughter rippled, brittle and eager. Elder Vashti raised a hand for silence and read the old law aloud. And then, without further ceremony, the tests began. Not combat, not pageantry, but the oldest measure the Dominion had. Real need, put in front of her, unrehearsed. A dispute came first. 2 pack elders from neighboring territories, locked for a decade over a boundary stream neither would yield. Aurelia had already tried her hand at it that morning and failed, offering land surveys and precedent neither elder cared to hear. Naia didn't offer either. She asked one elder about his daughter's wedding, held on that very stream bank 30 years before, and asked the other about the flooding that had once nearly taken his herd. She listened to what neither man was actually arguing about, and within the hour, the boundary dispute had become a shared irrigation agreement, and both old wolves were shaking hands as though the argument had never mattered. Then came the wounded. Soldiers back from the eastern ridge, torn by Duskmore blades, more of them than the palace healers could manage alone. Naia moved through them the way she moved through her own kitchen, unhurried, exact, murmuring the names of things that would ease a fever, set a fracture, calm a wound gone the wrong color. General Thorne, silent through the whole morning, watched her set a soldier's dislocated shoulder without flinching, and said nothing at all, which, from Thorne, was closer to reverence than anyone had heard from him in years. By afternoon, a litter of pups, orphaned by the same border fighting, snapping at anyone who came near, was brought into the circle as a final, unsanctioned test nobody had planned. Aurelia backed away without shame. Naia knelt in the dirt in her plain gray dress and simply waited, the way she'd waited for the wolf pup at the sanctuary, until the smallest one crept forward and pressed its head into her open palm. A handful of children broke from their parents' hands to crouch beside her in the dirt, unbothered by rank or ceremony, already asking to hold the smallest pup. Kael, watching from beside the council dais, felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with strategy or succession. He had spent 5 years hearing what a Luna required: bloodline, dowry, warriors offered as tribute, noble daughters reciting the qualifications like scripture. He had never once heard anyone name the thing he was watching now. A woman who listened until quarrels dissolved on their own, who healed because it never occurred to her not to, who could quiet a frightened animal with nothing but patience and an open hand. By the time the sun dropped behind the palace walls, even the rival alphas who'd come to watch her fail were watching her instead, with the particular silence reserved for people they no longer underestimated. 1. A broad, scarred pack leader from the Northern Territories, no friend to soft things, inclined his head to her as she passed, a fraction of a bow he hadn't given anyone in that circle all day. Naia didn't seem to notice. She was already crouched beside the last pup, checking its leg, entirely unaware that she'd just done, without trying, what every noble daughter in the Dominion had spent a lifetime failing to do on purpose. Kaelen watched her a moment longer, and let himself finally admit the truth the council had never once thought to ask him. She didn't need to become a Luna. She already was one. The council did not wait for morning. By torchlight, they reconvened in the throne hall itself. Elders in their formal moon-gray robes, Lady Aurelia seated at the front in silver-blue silk, General Thorne standing sentinel near the dais with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Word of the trial had already spread through every corridor of the palace, but compassion, Elder Vashti reminded the room as she rose to speak, was not the same as strategy. The girl has proven her heart, Vashti said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the tired weight of a woman who had spent decades believing kingdoms survived on treaties, not tenderness. No one in this hall doubts that any longer. But the Eastern Ridge does not fall to kindness, Your Majesty. It falls to steel, and to allies willing to bleed for us. Lady Aurelia brings 300 warriors as dowry. The healer brings a sanctuary of orphaned pups. Then let the record show, Kael said, that I have finally found something in this hall worth more than 300 warriors. The room went still, in the particular way rooms go still, right before something irreversible is said. Naia, standing at the edge of the circle where she'd stood the night before, felt her heart stop in a way that had nothing to do with fear of the council. Kael descended the dais steps, and every noble in that hall, Aurelia included, seemed to realize, a half-second too late, that he was not walking toward the throne. He crossed the stone floor to where Naia stood in her plain gray dress among healers and soldiers and Omega families, the same place she'd knelt for a frightened pup only a day before. "I spent 5 years being told what a Luna required," Kael said, loud enough now for the whole hall to carry it. "Bloodlines, dowries, warriors offered like coin. I sat through every one of those offers and felt nothing, and I began to believe the fault was mine, that I'd buried whatever part of me was meant to want any of it." He reached for Naia's hand. She let him take it. "I was wrong. The fault was never mine. It was that I spent years searching for the strongest Luna." His eyes didn't leave hers. "The moon goddess sent me the kindest one instead, and I have never in my life wanted anything as certainly as I want to keep her." Something ignited between them. Not metaphor, not courtly flourish, but real and physical. A warmth that surged up through their joined hands and settled low in both their chests at once. Naia gasped softly. Kael's wolf, restless for 5 long years, went suddenly, completely silent. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of an animal finally, fully at rest. The bond had woken. Fully, irrevocably. Aurelia rose from her seat, fury replacing composure. "This is not law. This is—" The doors at the rear of the hall exploded inward. Duskmoor warriors poured through the breach, gray-cloaked and moon-masked, faster than Thorn's stationed guards could close ranks. Screams broke out among the gathered nobles. Someone knocked a torch from its bracket, and firelight scattered wild shadows across the stone. Kael's wolf surged forward before his mind caught up to it, shifting the king into the warrior he'd been long before he was ever a crown. But the nearest attacker had already turned, blade raised, aimed not at him but at the unguarded healer standing frozen a step behind. Naia moved first. She'd spent years reading rooms nobody else bothered to watch, the elder who flinched before he spoke, the pup that startled before the storm arrived. She read the angle of that blade a half-second before it swung, and shoved Kael sideways with both hands, throwing herself into the space he'd vacated. The blade caught air instead of flesh. Kael's arm closed around her the instant they hit the ground, rolling her beneath him as the attacker stumbled past. "You should have run," he said, low and rough against her ear. "You'd have died," she said. "I don't negotiate that badly." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, meeting the next attacker with the brutal, economical violence of a king who had led armies long before he'd ever poured tea. But he fought differently now. Not the reckless fury of a man with nothing left to lose, but something sharper, more careful, because for the first time in 5 years he had someone standing behind him worth protecting. Naia was no warrior, but she was not helpless either. She hauled a wounded servant clear of the fighting, pressed a fallen blade into Thorn's reaching hand, called out warnings. "Left flank, he's circling left," with the same clear, unhurried voice she used to calm frightened pups. And somehow, impossibly, the defenders rallied around that voice as much as around Kael's blade. Together they drove the breach back toward the shattered doors, Kael's strength meeting Naia's steadiness, each covering the gap the other couldn't close alone, until the last of the Duskmoor warriors either fell or fled into the dark beyond the palace walls. Silence returned to the hall in pieces, broken glass and toppled torches, and the ragged breathing of everyone still standing. Kael turned, found Naia upright, unharmed, her hand pressed to a soldier's wound to slow the bleeding even now, even here, and felt the bond in his chest pull taut and certain. "Still healing people in the middle of a battle," he said. "Someone has to." She looked up at him, breathless, alive, entirely unbowed. "Apparently I married a king who forgets to duck." Around them, council and commoner alike began, slowly, to kneel. Not to the crown this time, but to the woman standing in the wreckage, with blood on her hands, and no fear at all in her eyes. 3 weeks after the Duskmoor attack, the Moon Dominion crowned a Luna it had never once considered, in a ceremony so different from the trial that had nearly broken her that Naia barely recognized the hall. No noble daughters lined up to compete this time, no elders reciting requirements like a ledger, just the same stone circle beneath the same ancient sky, filled now with warriors she'd stitched wounds for, servants who'd learned her name within a week of her arrival, and Omega families who had walked 3 days' distance because word had reached them of a healer who'd become their queen. Elder Vashti performed the binding herself, her voice steadier than it had been at the trial, stripped clean of doubt. By blood, by bond, by the will of the wolves she has served. She paused, and something almost like a smile crossed her weathered face. Rise, Luna Naia Nightfang. Naia rose. The whole circle rose with her, and this time, no one needed reminding to bow. Kael watched from the circle's edge, thinking of a stranger who'd once told him a headache didn't need sweetening, only honesty, and understood, watching an entire hall bow without hesitation, that he had never needed to convince anyone of what he'd known since that first cup of tea. Cedric Ashbourne did not attend the coronation. He had spent the weeks since the trial attempting, with increasing desperation, to remind the palace of his relation to their new Luna. A father's pride, he called it, though everyone who mattered had watched him arrive with 2 daughters and a well-rehearsed reunion the very week his youngest became useful. The council, no longer needing his alliance, quietly stopped returning his letters. His seat among the lesser nobles grew colder each season, until the Ashbourne name carried no more weight in the Dominion than any minor pax. Roughly, Naia reflected without much satisfaction, what it had always deserved. Her sisters fared differently, because Naia made certain of it. Celine left the capital before the season turned, not banished, but unwilling to stay somewhere her beauty no longer purchased anything. She wrote once, months later, from a coastal territory 2 kingdoms south, married to no one, running a modest trading house of her own. The letter was short. It was the first honest thing she had ever sent her youngest sister. Lyra stayed. It was Naia who suggested it, over Vashti's initial objection, that a mind as sharp as Lyra's belonged at the council table, not shut out of it for a father's failed ambitions. Lyra took the appointment without gratitude and without apology, which was simply how she loved people. Within a year, half the council deferred to her on matters of trade, and she never once thanked Naia for the opening. Naia never expected her to. The sanctuary took longer to settle, mostly because Kael refused to let it be moved, absorbed, or repurposed the way 3 separate council factions proposed. It stays, he told them, in the same flat tone he'd once used to end a war before it started. Under royal protection. Its own deed, its own name. The children do not relocate for anyone's convenience. Not the council's, not mine. The decree was carved into Dominion law within the month. Selwyn, insufferably pleased with himself, took to reminding every visiting dignitary that the sanctuary now technically outranked several minor territories in protected status. Kael kept his own promise besides. Several days each month, the Alpha King of the Moon Dominion left his throne in Thorn's capable hands and rode north to a patched-roof sanctuary that smelled of wood smoke and herbs, where 11 children had long since stopped asking whether he was coming back, because he always did. He found her there on an ordinary evening, the kind that had become the best kind. The children finally settled, the wolf pup, fully grown now and entirely unbothered by rank, sprawled across the hearth, the kitchen warm with the particular quiet of a day well spent. Naia handed him a cup without being asked. He looked at it before he drank, steam curling in the lamplight, the same modest cup she'd handed a dust-covered stranger on the worst afternoon of her life. He took the first sip, and something in his face eased the way it always did, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its shape. You still make it without honey, he said. You still prefer truth. He set the cup aside and kissed her forehead, unhurried, the way he did everything now that he no longer needed to guard against wanting it. Outside, the courtyard rang with the sound of children running, Tilly's laugh rising sharp and delighted above the rest, Bram pretending, badly, that he was too old to join the chase. The Moon Dominion had survived wars, betrayals, and a council that once believed love was a liability no kingdom could afford. It had never, in all its long history, been quite this peaceful. Naia leaned into him, and for the first time in either of their lives, neither one was waiting for the moment to end. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.